It was... It was all burning. The fire leapt into the night sky as the flames were reflected in the black waters of the canal as we watched it burn. My home was burning. My warehouse home was burning. My everything was burning. I was the things in that building, and it was burning. My cars, my art, my beautiful things were burning, and I felt it in my soul, which was burning. Embers lifted into the sky as 4 fire tenders doused the site. Sirens blared and the police held back the crowd gathering to watch the destruction. They were speaking over loud hailers. I cried. I cried real tears as my life was torn apart by whoever had done this. I assumed I'd get to tear them apart. For a start, there would be a world of hurt on the city streets tonight. A few hours earlier.
Boss.
Malcolm, my erstwhile slaving servant, was phoning me from home at a very inopportune time to bother me. I was mixing it up with the police force and having a fucking wonderful time making these people suffer. I was having the bestriest fun doing this shit. So I replied gracefully and delicately, "Fucking what, Malcolm? What the fuck do you want? There better be some serious shit going on, or you're in fucking something." Malcolm has been spoken about in past episodes in detail. He's my personal paedophilic pushover. He does all that shit that needs to be done for me in Manchester. It's normally a very serious situation when he phones, as he knows what happens if he wastes my very, very precious time. Text is usually his method of communication. I somewhat calmed down and tried to focus on the conversation. Okay. I'm breathing, I'm listening, this better be good or fucking terrible, Malcolm, because I'm like proper fuming at this moment.
I think that it's very important. You know the cufflinks you made from that vampire blood goddess thingy person's canines?
Oh, fuck off, Malcolm, what happened? They cost such a lot to get and set and stuff. You know, the waiting list for Purificats is oversubscribed for the time, and the silver work is exceptional. What happened? Please don't say you lost them. Please fucking don't say you lost them.
No, boss. I didn't lose them.
He paused before he continued. So? I was becoming even more impatient than usual.
Well, do you want to talk to her?
He asked. What? I thought, pausing for a while. Had poor Malcolm completely lost the plot? I mean, it was only time before he did, I suppose. Fen looked at me from the chair that he was lounging in. Talk to who? Who the fuck have you let in my house, you fucking Malcolm? If you've done your usual with a kiddie, I'm gonna be properly pissed off. You're gonna have to clear it up yourself. I'm fucking miles away. Just kill it and put it in the meat locker, then I'll get rid of the evidence when I get home. Don't tell me what you did with it. I need to be able to eat it. You know, certain things you are into put me off food. Oh, I was right perturbed. Had he let some stranger in my place? Oh, this was too much.
No, I didn't let her in, boss. She sort of just appeared,
he said. She who? There was a scramble as the phone was switched from Malcolm's ear to someone else's ear. Hello, lover. Sammy here. A woman's voice, but who the fuck was Sammy? I I didn't know her, Sammy. I knew her. Oh, shit. Fen sat up on his seat as I slapped my forehead. This was the last thing that I needed right now. I was super busy. I stared at the ceiling, wondering how the fuck I was gonna handle this. Threats, anger, feigned contrition. I know. Just wing it. Yep, the werewolf way. Let's wing it. Oh, hello, Sammy. So, you've done that rising from the dead thing then? Fen laughed in my brain at the stupidity of the discourse. I shot him the evilest look I could, and he could see from my face that this was one of those rare moments where the piss should not be taken. I knew I'd asked Sammy a shit question, but what do you say to a newly risen 8,000-year-old blood goddess that you had systematically tortured over a few years and then executed? It's not a conversation that many people have had, I think. Well, we are coming for you. And then the bitch hung up. Well, that complicates shit a little bit, huh? Fen said. I sat staring at the phone for some time. This was terrible. Well, actually, it was fucking terrible. She was back. I was horrified. What was I going to do? They were there in Manchester, in my home, and I was here. How was I going to... What was I going to... shitty shit sticks with shit on. Don't worry about Malcolm. He always lands on his feet. Fen was trying to reassure me. What? I asked. Who? Malcolm. Don't worry about him, he repeated. What? No, fuck Malcolm. He doesn't matter, but my stuff. Fen, my stuff. She could touch my stuff. What am I going to do, Fen? What am I going to do? My heart was breaking. She had me by the materialistic bollocks. The journey to Manchester was at warp factor 10, and finally I saw in the distance the flickering lights against the sky. There was a fire of vast proportions, and it was in full swing just about where my home of loveliness was. I was getting more upset and angry as I flew towards what I knew would be a really bad thing. A really, really, really bad thing. As I got closer, I could see that the side of the canal I called home, the buildings and the wharf were all in flames. Multiple fire crews were there, and I pulled over a few roads away from the hubbub. People were on the streets. The police had cordoned off the streets on either side of the fire. Crowds had gathered. This was free entertainment after all, a rare thing in Manchester. I wandered along the road, head down and hands stuffed deep into my pockets towards the two officers who were standing before the gateway to the access road to my home. Excuse me, Orifister, what's happened? I asked the first one. He was super young and still had some growing into his uniform and ears to do. There's been a bit of a fire, pal, was his witty, smiling retort. Well, he would go far in the police with his patronising sense of humour as long as I didn't rip his head off and shit down his neck right now, which was the beatific image in my head after his cunty reply. I struggled to give a fake laugh as the older of the two started to speak after giving the other a knowing smile and a slightly admonishing shake of the head. The boy gave an understanding nod and turned and walked away a little. Don't mind PC Harrison, sir. He's new to this. Standing around in the cold and he's not liking it. He's being a little testy. There are a few warehouses that have gone up on the dock. Definitely arson. Definitely an insurance job in my experience. So much accelerant, if you know what I mean. I mean petrol. That's accelerant's a posh word for petrol. He winked at the younger cop, who obviously knew that using the word accelerant was very, very sort of, I don't know, good. Yes, sir. So much accelerant that it is an open and closed case, in my opinion. Do you know anything about it, sir? He smirked. Yeah, I do, actually. I burnt it down, officer. I said as I offered my wrists for the cuffs. Now them being dumb fuckers stood open-mouthed for a moment, not really knowing what to say. Had I just admitted my guilt? I smiled and laughed. They realised I was winding them up at fucking last and laughed along with me. Very good, sir. Very good. Hey, Arthur, you almost had me there. The older police officer laughed. Any of it been saved? I asked. Don't think so, sir. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. I imagine it'll be cheap land for sale pretty soon, though. I nodded. Thanks, I said as a goodbye and turned to get back to the car and find a position from where my life could be watched burning. I would at least be able to enjoy my life, my loss, as it wasted away in its fiery, beautiful death. So here I am, sitting on the edge of the canal, my feet dangling above the cold, dark waters, watching and, in the episode's timeline, right back at the start of the episode. I love the way that we can do that in stories. And I was watching my love and my life, well, I said it enough at the start, burn. The blaze was getting under control and buildings were being collapsed around it and fire breaks were being formed. It would not only be my life that was ruined that night, but that didn't make me feel much better. Well, it did a little bit. I like lives being ruined. As I said, I was sat at the edge of the canal and I was exhausted. I'd felt more emotion in the last hour than ever in my life. All those years, all those things in there gone. The irreplaceable and the unique were now gone from this world. The world would pay, and the blood-sucking brother fucker would be next on my to-do list. They would be gone. I would get them gone after a few hours of torture and ultra-violence committed on some poor people in the area who'd done nothing, had caused nothing, but Fen stood behind me, an invisible shield wrapping his body around me. He was comforting. He was always there, and he knew I need him. I needed him. He was always there for me. And then,
Hello.
someone had managed to walk right up next to me without either me or Fen noticing. I could put this down to the distress of the situation and not being able to focus on anything else, or I could put it down to, well, there wasn't really anything I could put it down to. There was no way a fucking human could get that close without either of us noticing. I sniffed the air and listened. It was a human, it was definitely human, but worryingly it was very human. My senses gave me the perception of the shadow next to me that my eyes could not register yet, and that shadow was extra human. Everything about it was perfectly human. Humans are never perfect. I could sense no inflammation or stress, no cancer, no nothing, not even bad smells from anywhere, no body odour or bad breath, not even a pervasive smell of perspiration or the soap that would tackle it. I turned to look at the man to remember his face before I tore it off. He had given me my first fun bit of kill fury for tonight, but when I looked at him I paused. Something was off. "Hold up, Will," said Fen, looking at the man. I stood slowly as the man turned towards me. He was older, maybe early 50s. He had a barber jacket on and a flat cap, but not a farmer's flat cap, like a cool flat cap. He looked like a lord of the land. It was bizarre because he said nothing more. He just stood looking at the flames with his hands in his pockets. I was trying not to do awful things, and Fen had told me to hold up. Fen was the only reason I could hold up but that would only be as long as my patience held. The man unzipped his jacket slowly, slipped his hand into the interior and pulled a hip flask from its lining. He looked at the container as he unscrewed the lid, flipping it open and taking a swig of the liquid inside before sighing at the enjoyment of its contents. He turned to me and proffered the flask with a smile. I smelt the liquid within and sensed its alcoholic bite. He nodded at the flask and offered it again.
It's a Macallan.
18-year-old malt, last year's release, and from sherry oak barrels, I told him. He nodded with one of those strange smiles that people do when they're impressed with someone's knowledge.
It certainly is, and it's extremely palatable. It would seem to be something that would be a good libation for this opportune moment we're having.
I reached and gently took the flask from his hand. I sniffed the vessel's open neck, closing my eyes and losing myself in the smell of that most excellent of Speyside malts. The man was watching me as I opened my eyes. I held those eyes for a moment before raising the whiskey to salute him and taking a small drink that I ran around my mouth with my eyes closed to savour it fully before swallowing it. After gulping it down, I dropped my head to the floor. That's exceptional, I said. Thank you. I paused for the man to fill the gap with his name.
I feel like I already know you,
he said.
Will?
In most cases, this would have led to suspicion. I don't really do paranoia, but I'm particularly good at suspicion. I don't mind people or things out to get me as long as I know they're out to get me. I nodded and shrugged.
My name is Simon de Montfort,
he announced.
Does that name ring any bells with you by any chance?
He asked. I again shrugged as I looked at him. Not really in this century, I said. In past, yeah. He was the father of British democracy, took the power from the hands of the monarchy and gave it to the people, sort of. How did that work out for you? I asked him.
Not the worst thing I did back then, to be honest. But it all seemed like a good idea at the time.
He took another sip from the flask and looked at the fires, nodding towards them.
But that has little relevance to this conversation, I think. I'm a liaison to the...
I butted in. I don't actually give a fuck who you are, where you're from, what you do, or even what you might be. You're not normal, I can see that. You just met me at probably the worst possible time that you ever could. I am very, very upset at this, at what has happened. I dropped my head as my voice actually broke with emotion for a moment, and I paused, pointing at the far back, trying to get his focus off me. And I'm about to commit horrendous amounts of violence on everything I can just to make myself feel better. So, you obviously know who I am, and you obviously have a point. Can we get to that point before I choose what I'm going to do to you? Remember, the longer you take to think and talk, the longer I have to use my imagination to invent a torture or three to use on you. And to be honest, I don't have a lot of patience right now. The man briefly paused and met my eyes with his. He was not uncomfortable with the threat. He was actually uncomfortable because, well, I was rushing him.
Yes, well,
he said, turning and pointing to the now smoking ruins.
I know who did that. I know where they are. And I know how you can hurt them.
He said, turning towards me and smiling.
Succinct enough for you?
Perfect, I laughed, as the hoses extinguished the final flame. Only smoke rose from what had been my home. Okay, I'm now interested. What have you got to say? Please, tell me more. Samarat. This was delicious. This was pure torture for the beast that now stood before us. We were watching him whilst he watched what was precious, the most precious to him, burn. We stood somewhat at a distance as the werewolf looked across the canal to what was his burning life. The emotions that he presented to me fed me. The energy that he gave off as horror and revulsion at the sight before him literally excited me. It was like jolting electricity walking my spine. He sparkled with an aura of red pain as the energy of the moment bled from him. I love hurting the powerful things of this world. Hurting and breaking the wolf would be a beautiful waste of time in this immortal life of mine. He was a funny creature to me. Funny as in strange. I mean, he had no actual want of power. He was Nietzschean in almost all his ways but one. He needed no more power. He had enough. He lived, strangely, for things, and removing those things would be the worst possible trick I could undertake. I would destroy all that he loved in that one night. Those years of him torturing and playing with me had allowed me to learn the man, learn the beast, and how I could hurt him the most. This would be a long, slow breaking, starting quickly with this moment and then reaching into the decades ahead of us. My taloned hands would have a firm grip on his throat, squeezing at my warmth, possibly for centuries, or until I grew bored. The only things the werewolf had seemed to have any care for were his home, his wolf soul, and his hapless servant, Malcolm. I had destroyed 2 of them that night. I had wandered through that home of his and looked at the world of excess and beauty that he had lived in. Everything was an aesthetic wonder, the best of the best. His taste was exceptional and his collections were several one of a kind. His walls were full of the great master's paintings that had disappeared from history. The wines of his cellar were a sommelier's dream. His whiskey collection was 2 rooms and of the finest of the finest. Among everything, he had artifacts that he should not. I can only think that they were the originals. A beast like this, would not accept a copy. In one room, he had some documents on display in a specialized set of cabinets, I assume for their protection. There was the Magna Carta. Yes, the Magna Carta, the actual Magna Carta. He also had letters of Sir Francis Drake from his correspondence with the Queen, and the letter that Darwin sent to accept his place on the Beagle. They would be gone. I would take them from this world. I took great, almost sexual joy in smashing that cabinet and tearing its contents to tatters. My history was being unburied at this moment and exploited. My homeland was being ruined, so I would tear and burn these historical documents as a down payment on my revenge, and I would enjoy it. The furnishings of his home were those created by the best craftsmen of history, an eclectic mix of styles and eras. It really should have been a clashing barrage of uncoordinated chaos, but no. It was a home of exquisite perfection, and I could see that it was so loved and maintained, not by its owner, but by a worshipping slave, Will himself. I wandered his home and stroked, caressed, and thoroughly enjoyed what would be the last time anyone did any of this. At least, with my immortality, this moment would never be forgotten. His home, his cars, and his life would be gone in a few moments, and like those mortal lies that feed me when they're destroyed, this death of beauty would feed my innate passions. After the final tour of my enemy's home, I wandered through to the largest reception room where his Malcolm knelt in restrained silence, sobbing. He was my thrall now, partially drained and forced to imbibe my own blood. He was now mine. I owned him. He was a slave to me and would never be his past master's property again. I know Will had owned him for some reason, and that Malcolm was an important possession of his, as the man did all the work that Will and Fen did not want to do. He no longer had that possession. I did. I think the state I had Malcolm in now was much worse for Will than if I'd killed him. I now owned Will's property. Malcolm, the holder of many of his secrets. I could use the information inside this servant's head to learn to play with the wolf more. Torturing such a creature physically would not be the best revenge. The mental torture and removal of all that the wolf held dear would be the best way to break him, and break him I would. It would bring me joy. I had been resurrected again. It was my third rebirth and the most painful. All births are brutal and bloody, as was mine. The rite of Adashgunti was bathed in willing given blood to rebuild me from what was left. My spirit had been shredded in the ethereal plane in order for its return back onto this physical plane. My son was the architect of my rebirth. He had been accidentally released from his stony prison by fools foraging for glory. They had not got that glory. They had got their souls taken by the greater glory of him alone. He had then swept across the old world to me, taking the energy and life vitality from those in his path. He had crashed this island's shores with so much energy, that the skies had been rent by the most potent storms for decades. He was so strong, but so raw that he could only be quelled with my guidance. My boy, my perfect boy, was here again. He stood next to the wreckage of the human, now knelt on the floor, and he was the most beautiful thing I had ever known. He turned to me, deep, pulsing irises in those dark eyes. I felt the power in that look. He spoke in my mind as a wicked smile burned across his face. "Mother, it is time." He held out his hand for mine, and I took it as we walked from the room, dragging our prize. As we left the building, we turned to it. I lifted a hand, and in a moment, clicked my fingers. A small spell in the pantheon I controlled, but a flame took hold in the pool of petrol that was now covering the floor of Will's beautiful car collection. There was no visible flame, but an audible whoomph told us that it had taken hold. We laughed as a shiver ran through my body, and we then turned into the darkening night. Thanks for listening to Werewolf the Podcast. Down in the description are lots of things, just lots of things. Social media, works of fiction, faction and wonder. Go check out the description. Go join some of the groups. Go meet some social people. Go find some wonderful books written by some wonderful authors. Most of all, I just have to say at this point, always remember, I love you.